99% of the ocean is in fact an aquatic desert. The oceans store 90% of global warming today, and it's storing that heat in the surface of the ocean in a thick, warm layer of water that actually is causing the problem. It's shutting down the currents that go from the deep up to the surface. And when we shut down those currents, we shut down the food source for the plankton. I first had the idea for marine permaculture when I was studying the plankton of the oceans, and I was amazed that half the oxygen we breathe comes from the plankton of the oceans. And it's the plankton forests and the kelp forests that we have to restore in addition to our land forests to really balance the earth and balance carbon in the Earth's atmosphere. Kelp forests are one of the most miraculous ecosystems on Earth. The kelp forest and the kelp species of Macrocystis is the fastest growing tree on Earth. It can grow nearly half a meter per day. These kelp forests are the fastest growing primary production that we have on the planet. And restoring these kelp forests is an opportunity to create an entire ecosystem. Not only are we restoring primary productivity, but we're creating habitat and food for fish. What we're planning to do is in several phases demonstrate the ability to grow kilometer-scale forests in the middle of the ocean. We call this marine permaculture. Marine permaculture is about adapting the natural ecosystems that exist in the oceans today, and in our lakes and rivers and streams, and in our soils, and adapting those natural ecosystems to help mankind and to help the Earth survive and to help the Earth maintain carbon balance. So what we've been doing over the past several centuries, we can call carbon footprints. And what we'd like to do over the next several years, with your help, are to create carbon handprints. What can we do actively to erase our carbon footprints and actually build for the future? Part of this effort is called our Healthy Climate Project. And the objective of our Healthy Climate Project is to go beyond business as usual, as shown in the dark blue line, past the light blue line, which is where we can work on in terms of doing the best we can with renewable energy, solar and wind and everything else. If that's all we do, we get the light blue line, which still produces temperature increases. And to move towards a healthy climate and our Healthy Climate Project, which is to actually draw carbon out of the atmosphere and get back to a healthy climate. And that healthy climate will ultimately have 0 degrees of global warming. So that is the principle behind what we're doing. The way we do it is with permacultures. And permacultures start with a natural ecosystem, a polycultural natural ecosystem. And with minimal adjustments and refinements, we can adapt those to help mankind and help restore fish, fisheries, and ecosystems in general. So it's that principle that we're utilizing, and I'll describe for you several examples today, including starting with the ocean, marine permaculture, and going beyond that to lakes, rivers, and streams, and beyond that to soils. And I look forward to sharing that with you. The way we are scaling this system now and in the years ahead is with food security. Why? Because everyone wants enough food, and we're looking at close to 10 billion people in the coming years. So if we can increase our food security nation by nation, region by region, and at the same time measure our carbon export, we have a scalable method with or without a price on carbon. And we see that as the go-forward strategy, particularly during the next 4 years. So how do we start in the ocean? A major observation is that 93% of global warming today is going into the oceans. The surface layers of the oceans are getting warmer and warmer. And what it's doing is disrupting major ecosystems. One of the ways we're getting disruption is that in the subtropical and tropical regions, there's a process of natural overturning circulation. That process gets disrupted when the water gets too warm. The energy barriers become too high. And the net result is we don't get the overturning that naturally fed macroalgae, microalgae, and entire ecosystems. So the question is there a way that we can actually restore overturning circulation and restore that fundamental supply of nutrients to those ecosystems? Now, it's important for a moment to take stock of our carbon stores throughout our biosphere. The atmosphere has approximately 840 gigatons of carbon. The ocean has over 38,000 gigatons of carbon. That means that there's over 45 times as much carbon in the ocean today as there is in the entire atmosphere. In fact, the living systems in our ocean over the past several hundred years have actually given mankind a 30% discount on atmospheric CO2 because roughly a third of all of man's carbon is in the ocean today. So the problem is not so much having carbon in the ocean, because if you took all of this carbon and you put it uniformly distributed throughout the ocean, the change in carbon would be less than 2%. The problem is that of distribution of the carbon. And that's the challenge, is that the upper ocean has a disproportionate share of oceanic CO2. And the challenge and the opportunity is to actually help restore the biological pump that drives CO2 out of the upper ocean, and fixed carbon is brought to the middle and deep ocean. So that presents an opportunity, and that works for mid-oceanic systems. It also works for shoreline systems and even kelp forests. So the question is, how could we go about doing this? Over the past decade, I've learned that on the western shores of the United States, in fact, in most of Western Australia, we've seen decimated kelp forests. And the problems have been very much due to thermal increases in the subtropical and temperate oceans. We've seen, between the warm blob coming down from Alaska, the El Nino of the past couple years, and global warming in general, a partial shutdown of the California current upwelling. And that partial shutdown has devastated many kelp forests. It has also devastated seal and sea lion populations and associated seabirds. And so the question is, how do we restore this kind of productivity to those parts of the ocean and in the region in general to be able to get that biological productivity to come back? Now, kelp itself is the fastest growing tree on Earth. It can grow over 1/2 meter, nearly 2 feet per day. And so that means if we can create the correct conditions, the right substrates, the holdfast, the right nutrient levels, we can in fact grow these forests very quickly. And when we do, we'll also create habitat for forage fish, sea lions, sea otters, and you name it, build the entire ecosystem back. I like to think of the kelp forest in general, and a kelp leaf in particular, as the world's least expensive solar cell. And the reason I think of it that way is that this solar cell requires no land area, it requires no fresh water, and it's self-assembling. What more could you like? It even has a storage mechanism. The storage mechanism are the polysaccharides and the carbohydrates that comprises the kelp itself. So with this kind of a incredible whole meal deal, so to speak, we should go to town, because there's a huge portion of the earth that is covered by the sea, and this adapted kelp leaf is designed ideally for that sea. Now, it turns out in warmer parts of the world, you normally don't see kelp forests, but that's not actually due to the temperature, it's actually due to the nutrient levels. And so by restoring overturning circulation, even in warmer waters, it turns out California kelp grows optimally between 20 and 25 Celsius. And in fact, with replete nutrients, Baja kelp grows optimally between 25 and 30 Celsius. So these very high temperatures, in fact, can be addressed and overcome if the nutrient supply is available. And so the question is, for the 70% of the Earth that is not covered with land, how can we actually restore conditions that would be conducive to these ocean kelp forests, for example? Well, here's an example of the overturning circulation that existed before global climate change and global warming. On the left side, you can see that there's wind stress that ends up providing enough energy and enough power to actually bring the cooler waters with higher nutrient levels up to the surface, and that upwelling can feed the critical marine ecosystems that are present. Now, with climate change, there's less circulation, and there's a thicker layer of warmer water, and that thicker layer of warmer water presents too much of an energy barrier to actually get nutrients up to the surface. And so we propose, as an alternative, to provide this marine permaculture that actually restores upwelling to the surface, and that upwelling occurs because we have wave energy, which I'll show you momentarily. That wave energy drives a simple pump system, and that pump system brings that water back to the surface to replace the system that is broken down due to climate disruption. So we like to think of this as an ocean fish spring, so to speak. The swell that goes up and down ends up driving a flapper valve, and that flapper valve enables the water to come up to the surface. And the key addition is that we've found a way to ensure buoyancy of this higher nutrient water, and that buoyancy keeps the nutrients close to the plants where they can actually help substantially with the restoration of the ecosystem. So the very first system, I'm happy to say, is being funded by the Australian national government, and we'll be going there next 2 weeks to actually get the planning done for the system done and deploying the very first system in the Indian Ocean. The way the system works is that there's a deep pump that will provide the wave-driven deeper water up to the surface. It gets mixed with shallower water, and the troughs themselves, we plan to actually provide the initial seaweeds that will be grown and confirmed to grow in a better way with restored temperature and nutrients of the system. The larger marine permaculture array, or MPA for short, is an elevation model shown here. This system could go as deep as 500 meters, and at this depth, there's a larger valve here that actually provides water up towards the surface. There's a heat exchanger at this point, and what the heat exchanger does is it actually brings the water temperature of the deep water up within 2 degrees of the surface water. And by bringing it up within 2 degrees, we can establish a buoyancy condition for the deeper water, which means that when we irrigate a square kilometer of kelp, the water will in fact flow past the kelp and up to the surface. And so that means the macroalgae can absorb the nitrate and phosphate directly into its tissues. Kelp is a wonderfully autotrophic plant, which means that it will assimilate the nitrate and the phosphate directly, and it creates biological material out of the inorganic materials that are available to it. There's also a very interesting effect, and that is whatever nutrients are not used by the kelp can be used by other organisms, and this ends up providing additional food for forage fish. Normal plankton, after they die, would sink at a carbon to phosphorus ratio of around 106 to 1. However, there are nitrogen-fixing plankton called diazotrophs, and the nitrogen-fixing plankton have higher ratios, potentially of 200 to 1 up to 500 to 1, and these take extra carbon with them. And so what normally would be a zero-sum game, and that is 106 upwelled carbon atoms for every phosphorus atom, would be zero-sum if it was just normal plankton. With the diazotrophic plankton, there can be an excess. And the great news is that kelp and other seaweeds have even higher ratios, starting with brown kelp macrocystis, which is the California giant kelp, at around 221. Some red seaweeds have carbon to phosphorus ratios exceeding 1,000 to 1. The net result is that there's a lot more carbon that goes with kelp that goes back to the middle and deep ocean. So from that perspective, there's an enormous opportunity for these ecosystems to actually restore carbon balance to the middle and deep ocean very effectively. We field tested these upwelling pumps some 8 years ago off of Hawaii, north of Hawaii, with a large flapper valve that opened and closed with each wave. This system was deployed on the Kilo Moana with help from the University of Hawaii. The system was so effective that in 57 hours we attracted lots of marine life. We attracted forage fish, we attracted larger fish, and in fact 2 weeks later we went back to retrieve the pumps and we still had a whale shark some 17 feet long eating plankton that had been made from this upwelling system. So for me it was a natural validation that saying that this is a very promising approach that would have lasting effects. But one key thing I noticed is the forage fish had no place to hide. They had no place to protect themselves and were being decimated. And that's where we started with the kelp forest idea, because that kelp would benefit directly from the macronutrients and would provide habitat and food for forage fish and build up the foundation of the food pyramid. So with the Blue Economy Challenge that we're beginning this year, we'll deploy a marine permaculture array in the Indian Ocean, and we'll be able to cultivate seaweeds. There's a seaweed that grows here called spinosum, but they've been unable to grow the higher value seaweed called cotonii, and even the spinosum is having trouble because the waters here have become too warm with too little nutrients. And this has been a great problem for over 10,000 seaweed farmers, most of whom are women in Zanzibar. So the challenge and the opportunity is to turn that around with cooler, deeper water that has higher nutrients and taking it offshore to have less impact on the shoreline.
Early in our planning process for the development of marine permaculture arrays, we recognized the importance of leveraging as much low-cost, pre-existing technology and infrastructure as possible. Zanzibar's seaweed industry exports more than 10,000 dry tons per year, but warming waters and decreased upwelling have generated great demand for our permaculture arrays. Our team includes the head of one of the largest seaweed companies in the world, operating in Zanzibar, who has offered us access to the relevant supply chains, as well as support for planning, deployment, and maintenance. The array includes an anchored valve which harnesses wave energy through a buoy and steel cable, feeding deep, cold, nutritious water to an array of seaweed troughs near the surface. The mooring, buoys, cables, chains, and ropes are all standard commercial marine equipment, requiring no component development on our part. Wave-driven pumps have been developed by the Climate Foundation's Executive Director, Dr. Brian von Herzen, and our team of engineers. This video, produced by the Discovery Channel, demonstrates the use of these pumps to upwell cool, nutrient-rich water from 315 meters below the ocean surface off Hawaii, more than 100 meters deeper than would be required based on the temperature and nutrient profiles near Zanzibar. The system caused a clear reduction in surface temperature and supported a variety of marine life during the demonstration. We use proven, high-density polyethylene pipe material because it's strong, resistant to biofouling, and can be assembled on location using standard polymer welding processes. These pipes are also used in seawater air conditioning, or SWAC, such as the pipe shown here from a system in Bora Bora. A similar pipe has been operating at Nelha in Hawaii since 1987. The MPA troughs are designed to contain the cool, nutrient-rich water around the plants. Like the upwelling pipe, the troughs are composed of high-density polyethylene. In modeling these troughs, we're conducting structural simulations to confirm their ability to withstand anomalous storms and other contingencies at minimal cost. Finite element modeling to optimize the design for minimum cost and maximum structural integrity will be completed through the remainder of 2016. The majority of the subsystems are commercially available products that are easily pieced together. The wave-driven pump, including the valve, has been demonstrated successfully by Dr. von Herzen with a team at the University of Hawaii. The final piece of the system under development is the troughs, which are presently undergoing simulation and optimization. This final piece, and thus the whole system, will be ready for pilot deployment by early 2017.
So, this system will initially be developed and monetized based on food security, specifically forage fish and game fish around these marine permaculture arrays. In addition, the seaweed itself is edible and comprises a multi-billion-dollar market. Beyond that, it was mentioned earlier today that livestock feed is a key opportunity. The very first seaweeds that will grow in the Indian Ocean are red seaweeds, and some of those red seaweeds at a concentration as a food supplement for cows of 2% are able to eliminate 50 to 70% of the methane that's produced by these cows. Now this is an amazing food supplement, and with a 2% food additive, being able to eliminate more than half of the methane produced by cows would be a really huge opportunity. So this is something that we're now developing with the help of Australian researchers who've discovered this new principle. And then beyond that, there's plenty of phosphate and beyond that, trace minerals that are present in kelp itself, and so harvesting that can be a great way to restore fertilizer, and it can actually get us over peak phosphate. In other words, we have limited mineral phosphate reserves, but by tapping the phosphate in the ocean, we can go for centuries in a sustainable way in terms of providing the necessary macronutrients for fertilizing the soils as needed. Finally, the Department of Energy has developed some programs in the area of biofuels, and we believe ultimately that growing biofuels based on kelp in the middle of the ocean could be vastly superior than continuing to tap into fossil fuel systems. Nonetheless, this could potentially leverage our existing downstream infrastructure. It's just the biocrude would be pumped at sea rather than going to fossil wells. There's another thing that the marine permacultures can potentially do, and it's something that has come to our attention recently, that fundamentally, not only do the marine permaculture arrays help restore a kelp forest, but it also cools off the surface of the ocean. And where have we seen enormous effects of this? But in places, for example, in coral reefs, where we found that the high ocean temperatures result in thermally induced photobleaching. This system has been a serious problem, and in 2009, we went to American Samoa and actually demonstrated the ability to reverse coral bleaching on the reefs in American Samoa. We went to a site that bleached every year. On the left-hand side, you can see our Coral Watch chart and the bleached branching corals that were present at the time. We managed to cool off the reef water around those corals by 0.7 degrees Celsius. And by measuring those temperatures using these handy little hobo temperature meters, which are made on Cape Cod, we were able to actually restore these corals to color. We were expecting it to take a month or two. And the amazing thing is that the results we got is that 18 to 24 hours, these corals went from their bleached white state to that colored state. There's a mystery to many biologists. Thank you. And so we see an opportunity to take this kind of technology and knowledge to the reef managers in Australia and understand that there's a potential here. The potential is that where you have reefs that have healthy herbivores, for a period of 6 weeks, could we actually situate and place marine permaculture arrays some tens of kilometers offshore and actually cool off large regions, perhaps kilometers or tens of kilometers of reef, and actually cool them off enough to keep them from bleaching? That's what we see as a major opportunity, and an opportunity to keep the Great Barrier Reef and other reefs alive during the difficult decades to come. So we see this as a multiple value opportunity, and keeping the reefs alive, for me, really gets me up in the morning. So along those lines, we see a key opportunity, not only in rural regions, but we've been working in Honolulu, for example, with a seawater air conditioning company that is very close to breaking ground on 100 megawatts of deep seawater air conditioning for Honolulu. Now that deep water they upwell has 100 megawatts for the city itself, but the return flow still has 150 megawatts thermal. And that 150 megawatts thermal is not cool enough to cool off the buildings, but it's plenty cool enough to protect the reefs. And with that closed system, there's no addition of nutrients at all to the reef. We did a dive survey off of the outfall region just last December off of Honolulu and found a place where potentially kilometers of reef could be protected using this technique. And once we demonstrated at scale, we could actually take this to high value reefs, for example, off of Guam, where the US Navy is planning to do 40 megawatts of deep seawater cooling for its military operations. So we see many opportunities to protect the cities and also protect nearby reefs at the same time using this technology and alternative means. There's another aspect. When the waves aren't present and we don't get any upwelling, it turns out there's a way to keep these nutrients near the surface. And in 1952, Henry Stommel developed this salt fountain, is what he called it. And that's where you have saltier overlying water overlying the deeper, fresher water. The net result is you can create a two-way exchange, and that exchange uses the salt difference to actually perpetuate itself. So I looked across the North Pacific and the South Pacific, and this is a profile from 55 degrees north down to a latitude, I believe, of minus 55 south. And in this region of the subtropical and tropical oceans, there is much higher salinity in the top 300 or 400 meters than deeper. So if we upwell water from 500 meters and bring it up to the surface, there's over a part per thousand difference in salinity. And that difference in salinity enables us to establish a buoyancy condition for the higher nutrient water. So it's this salinity difference that enables us to keep going. In fact, you can map out the world's oceans, and you can find that in these yellow and orange regions, you actually have the salinity difference, which means that you can actually continue to provide restoring overturning circulation to large parts of the ocean, which can actually cool off the surface ocean by a couple degrees and potentially even ultimately mitigate from hurricanes and also mitigate from bleaching events. So we see this as a key opportunity that helps to restore and sustain those ecosystems, as well as the kelp forests that'll be floating along with our marine permaculture structures. Here's a small picture of a two-dimensional simulation of the salt double diffusion mixing that takes place with this process. And that's where the warm salty water sinks down while the cooler fresher water rises to the surface. And it turns out that this is validated in oceanographic maps, this one at 1,000 meters depth, this one at 500 meters depth, and this one at the surface, showing that major portions of the subtropical and tropical oceans are amenable to this approach. And it's really an opportunity for us to make a big difference. Here are some of the calculations at 35 parts per thousand salinity, 1 part per thousand difference, and 2 degrees approach temperature. That makes it practical to use a heat exchanger with an approach temperature of 2 degrees Celsius. In addition, there are fluid dynamics such as mesoscale eddies that enable us to actually hydrodynamically capture the nutrients in these eddies, and it's our intention to operate the marine permaculture arrays in these eddies as they cross the Pacific Ocean. Effectively, the way soaring birds soar on thermals, it's possible to actually navigate and guide these floating systems so that they can be robotically self-navigated. And from that perspective, it presents a great opportunity to actually have these systems guided automatically with satellite communication. In fact, a company in Sunnyvale, California called Liquid Robotics has deployed many of these gliders and sailed one from San Francisco to Hawaii and all the way to Australia. In fact, we have several of these liquid robotics gliders at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution where they carry out oceanographic research. So it's this principle of self-guided autonomous underwater vehicles that can actually save the day in a sense in enabling us to utilize the pelagic or ocean that's far offshore to actually provide these essential resources. Now, leaving the oceans for a moment, or at least the open oceans, I'd like to talk with you about an amazing event that occurred 49 million years ago. What if I told you that a single plant single-handedly drew down 3,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide in less than 800,000 years? Well, this lowly plant is called Azolla, and it turned out in the Arctic Ocean, it was very warm back then, and you'll notice from these tectonic shifts that the Arctic Ocean was largely closed off. The Bering Sea wasn't open, and there was less circulation. The net result is a lot of fresh water flowed into the Arctic Ocean, and the Arctic Ocean was actually stagnant below several hundred meters down, in the sense that it was anoxic. It had very little oxygen. So every springtime, the Azolla plants would grow out from the river deltas and would start to create a freshwater lens over the Arctic Ocean. And as they grew, they expanded in size. The doubling time of Azolla is less than 3 days. And it's actually a symbiosis between a water fern and a cyanobacterium. The net result is the cyanobacterium fixes its own nitrogen. So with enough phosphate, the Azolla grows, and it grows very quickly. In fact, it lives naturally in Louisiana today. So the great opportunity, and what seems to have occurred from the geologic evidence, is that the Azolla grew and spread out over up to 1 million square kilometers. And every fall, when the sunlight failed, the Azolla would die and sink to the bottom of the ocean, laying down a layer of carbon. And that carbon represents most of the oil that we find in the Arctic today. So it's amazing that a lowly plant that grows 10 centimeters thick was able to produce so much carbon in so little time. And we look to Azolla as a very interesting plant because it's another ecosystem that existed 49 million years ago. We still have 7 species of Azolla on this planet. How could we better understand how this plant works and see if there's a way that it could actually help us in this question of carbon balance? So there's been much research on Azolla, including at the Azolla Foundation, and it grows naturally in small ponds and lakes and even rivers and streams. And it's a really amazing plant that has incredible properties. One of those properties are omega-3 fatty acids, in particular DHA and EPA. And it turns out what makes salmon so good is that they eat plankton and they get their omega-3s from the plankton itself. And it's that DHA and EPA that makes the salmon, the sardines, and the anchovies brain food, because it provides essential omega-3 fatty acids that we need for healthy neurons and healthy cognitive function. It turns out Azolla has the same property. So here's this great vegetarian source of EPA and DHA that is something that will help cognitive health for decades to come, and it's something that's naturally available. So we see this as a very key plant, and it's the symbiosis with the Anabaena cyanobacterium that fixes nitrogen that enables this to work. So we're doing continuing research on this near our facility near Lake Tahoe. Finally, I'm going to talk with
How much carbon did it pull down?
the Azolla pulled down, well, there was a 3,000 part per million reduction in carbon dioxide. And we're looking for 140, according to the talks yesterday. So from that perspective, 1/20th of what Azolla did in the past would be sufficient to take care of our entire carbon problem if we found a suitable place and environment to actually apply Azolla. So from that perspective, it presents an enormous opportunity, and most of that drawdown appears to have been done by the Azolla itself. So it's very encouraging. Finally, there's been a number of discussions today about biochar in particular and food security on land. And we have worked over the past half a decade in looking at how we can actually restore degraded soil ecosystems. Now, this map is really significant to me because it shows in the red regions all the severely degraded soils on the planet. And it includes most of India. It includes substantial parts of North America as well. And these very degraded and degraded soils are often degraded because of mankind's actions over the past 10,000 years. So our challenge and our opportunity is to actually turn this around. For 6,000 years, man has been turning forests into desert. And now, I believe, over the last decade, we've begun to really understand how to turn depleted lands back to productivity. So we see that as a key opportunity for soil health as well as for ocean health. And we use biochar as a key component of this. This is an example of some of the biochar that we've made. Biochar is a fixed form of carbon that itself is biologically unavailable, but creates an incredible substrate for nutrients and fertilizer. They absorb carbon, and biochar has a high surface area, a high cation exchange capacity, and it's a great foundation for composting and for microbial communities. We have developed a biochar reactor with assistance from the Gates Foundation and other groups, including the Herzen Foundation, and we were able to take high moisture biomass with moisture levels of up to 75% and actually reduce it and generate biochar. And that is done at a temperature of between 300 and 700 degrees Celsius, and it ends up being a great start for a composting process. We've developed a container-sized system that can process tons of biomass per day. Those are in deployment in India as well as in North America. And we see this as a key opportunity to take waste biomass and turn it into fixed carbon. There's also plenty of room in the soils, as we saw earlier, thousands of gigatons of carbon in soils. And by restoring the content of the soil, we view that as soil capital. We like to think of that carbon capital as a way to rebuild the productivity of soils for decades to come. And so when we think about natural capital, environmental capital, human capital, we should also think about soil capital and carbon capital, because we see this as a way of investing for the future. In 2014, we demonstrated this system in New Delhi, India, and this system is deployed and running in India today. Now, we just won with the University of Chicago their Urban Labs Innovation Challenge, and this challenge is to actually help reduce air pollution in India nominally. Delhi has some of the worst air pollution in the world, particulate matters exceeding 400 parts per million. And it's largely due to this practice over the last 30 to 40 years of taking rice straw and burning it to make room for the winter wheat, and at which time you get extremely polluted cities, particularly this time of year. Now, the new practice that we will be testing in Delhi early next year is to take the straw, run it through the biochar reactor to form biochar, and this biochar then is combined with compost to actually restore depleted soils and restore agriculture. We have more than 10 million acres of saline soils and alkaline soils in northern India alone, in the provinces of Haryana and Punjab. We see similar problems actually in the US, particularly in the Southwest in regions, for example, in California. So we see a distinct opportunity as we go forward to restore depleted soils, reduce our dependence on NPK fertilizers, and really rely on living microbial ecosystems in those soils to actually make the system work much more reliably and with far less runoff. The potential exists to decimate the runoff levels using this kind of technology. So we see this as a real sustainable way of getting carbon cycling and phosphate cycling back into our ecosystems. The biggest risk, we believe, is that of doing nothing, and we think that it's essential to identify opportunities to utilize these natural ecosystems to actually improve our food security and measure the carbon export out of the atmosphere. Please consider joining the Healthy Climate Project. It's on a website. The fundamental saying is that we pledge to each other and to our children that we dedicate ourselves and our resources to restoring a healthy climate with 0 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Live, learn, and prosper. We have with me Rebecca Truman and Jim Newman, and they're here in the audience. We'd love to talk with you this afternoon, and thank you so much for your attention.